part of what I want to accomplish this morning is just introduce myself to all of you, and also talk about some of the issues that I'm going to be doing research on, and some of the pertinent issues I think facing the Missouri education system today. So to start here, about just who I am, I'm from Kansas City, born and raised. I grew up in Waldo before Waldo was Waldo. Now I found everyone says, Waldo's this cool, oh, you know, we want to go out in Waldo. It's like, we want to go out in Waldo? What are you guys talking about? Like, grew up there, not quite. I went to St. Elizabeth's at 75th and Main, and then on to Rockhurst High School. And since then, I've been kind of going around the country, involved in education in various ways. We can start sort of with my education. So I went to college at St. Louis University, where I was an English literature major. I like to say, I don't mean to offend any English majors here, but I majored in a hobby. It was kind of a book club. We read books and we talked about them and how they made us feel. After that, I became a high school teacher. I taught with a program through the University of Notre Dame, Go Irish, called the Alliance for Catholic Education, which while I was working on my master's degree in teaching, I taught in an underserved Catholic school. I taught at a little school called St. Jude Educational Institute, which is on the west side of Montgomery, Alabama. And it was one of, there used to be a lot more of them, and now there are fewer, of historically African-American Catholic schools. It was started in the 1940s and actually was the last stop on the march from Selma to Montgomery. So it was the last campground that was there, and that night they held the Concert for Freedom. So it was Ben Vereen and Peter, Paul, and Mary and Sammy Davis Jr. were on the grounds of the school. After that, I went and got my PhD at the University of Arkansas, go Hogs, in education policy. And after that, I moved to Washington, D.C., where I've been for the last 3 years researching and writing on education. So I've written in a lot of outlets here, from the Washington Post, U.S. News and World Report, USA Today. In fact, when the Washington Examiner, the conservative newspaper in D.C., relaunched as a news magazine, I wrote the first cover story for them. It wasn't my title, Back to Bad Schools, wasn't really what I wanted to say, but you don't get to pick your headlines. I've also done a bunch of kind of nerdy research type stuff in peer-reviewed journals, everything from National Affairs, Education, Finance, and Policy, and School Choice. And I've also written or edited 5 books on topics ranging from the Obama presidency and education, the Common Core, teacher quality, school choice, and general kind of education and opportunity. So I've kind of run the gambit on a variety of different issues, but really what I found myself doing more and more is playing the role of Mythbuster. As I come back home to Kansas City, you know, it's funny. I think if I had gone away and gotten a PhD in something other than education, so, you know, if I'd gotten something in maybe international relations, I feel like when I came home and I saw my aunts and uncles and cousins that I haven't seen in a long time, you know, they'd say, oh, you know, I've heard this thing's happening over in Iran. You're an expert in international relations. Think you could tell me something about that? Or if I majored in, you know, biology or something, if someone was sick, or if I was a medical doctor, they'd say, you know, my elbow's hurting me. Is there anything? When you say that you have a PhD in education, the first thing people tell you, you know what it is? So this is what we need to do about the American education system. And unfortunately, so I love that, and it's great, and we should totally talk about it, and I'm happy that people are invested in these topics. But what I have found in having these conversations is that oftentimes a lot of what people think about education are based in myths. And what they think we should do about the education system are based in myths. So I hope to dispel. Now look, if we want to spend the next 5, 6, 7 weeks together, there's lots of myths. So I tried to pick some fun ones that we could talk about on this beautiful Kansas City morning. And the first myth that I would like to dispel is, I think, a persistent myth that exists all around the country, and it is this belief that the schools of the future, or the schools that we want to design today, have to look like the schools that have always existed. So here's a picture of actually where we are. So for those of you that are not familiar, Kansas City, Missouri in 1940 took a picture of every building in the city. So if you live within Kansas City and your home is older than 1940, you can go on the city's website and you can find a picture of your house. This is the building that we are in currently. We're right here. And you know, I think to myself, if we were to all hop in a time machine and head back to this time period, much of this would look very foreign to us. The cars would look foreign, the dress would look foreign. I have no idea what this furniture cost. It was probably like, you know, a buffalo nickel or something for a table. But one of the few things that I think would look familiar to us is a school. right? So if you look at the way schools operated in 1940 or 1920, you'd walk in, you'd see a room set up not unlike this with rows of desks, a teacher in the front of the room giving instruction to a classroom of 20 or 25 students. They're generally speaking all the same age. They're progressing through the state's curriculum. This is something that we've been doing for a very long period of time. But just because we've been doing this for a very long period of time doesn't mean that we need to continue to do this. So I'm going to show you a picture. This is a charter school in Chicago right now that uses what's generally called a kind of blended learning model. So if you look at this, in one classroom you have multiple teachers. It's divided into, you can see a student back here kind of working by himself on a project, small groups here and here, students here working on sort of guided curriculum. They have their headphones on, they're paying attention. You have teachers working in small groups here. But this is a way that says we're not going to take the sort of schoolhouse as given, the classroom as given, and work to try and find an environment that encourages collaboration, personalization, and all of the things that technology and advances have allowed us to do. Now this is, I think, one of the most interesting things that's happening in American education today, and probably something that none of you have heard about. Have any of you heard about tiny schools? I know tiny schools, you know tiny schools, outstanding. This is a tiny school in New Orleans. And what a tiny school is if you think about starting a new school. So if you'd like to start a charter school, if you'd like to start a private school, if you'd like to start a traditional public school, it is an incredibly expensive and risky operation, right? You have to get a building, you have to find, we have the principal of a charter school right next door, De La Salle. He'd be the first to tell you, getting a building, getting a staff, getting everyone is an incredibly risky, intensive process. What a group of people down in New Orleans started was this idea kind of based on the principle of like pop-up restaurants. You know, so if a chef wants to try something new, rather than open up a new restaurant, he might say, hey, we're just going to set up a food truck or a food stand somewhere. It's a lot less expensive, a lot less risky. If it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out, and we're not out a whole lot of money. In New Orleans, a group called 4.0 Schools and others are allowing people who think that they might want to start a school, innovative teachers, some they're doing different, to say, hey, why don't we we'll go in on a Saturday morning, and you'll just teach a very small number of students. People will be watching to help you. This is actually a parochial tiny school. You can see the nun here that's there. They're able to experiment, to try new things, and then if they're successful in this very small environment on Saturdays on a volunteer basis, then they might be able to grow to either serve a whole classroom of students or eventually serve a whole school. So it's a way to change the way we start schools, the way we develop talent, the way we iterate and practice and develop better teaching and everything like that. Now, you'll notice the last two types of schools that I talked about were parochial schools and charter schools. And these are generally known as schools of choice. They're outside of what we call the traditional public school system. And I know some of you may be thinking what is related to our second myth, which is this belief that school choice hurts public schools, right? So allowing people to leave via school choice or school vouchers and others is on net harmful for the American public school system. And as you might imagine, I don't think that the evidence backs up this position. So the first way to simply look at this is to look at charter schools and what we know about the performance of students who attend charter schools. Now, one of the best studies that we have, most comprehensive ones looking across the country, is a group of researchers at Stanford for the Credo organization that's based there, that did a big study of charter schools all across the country. And when we look at the performance of students, and this is just the sort of subsection of urban charter schools. They looked at a lot of suburban charter schools, which we can talk about how the findings were a little bit different in suburban areas. But you can see on average and in aggregate. So that's important caveat at the beginning. On average, this isn't necessarily in every single case, but on average and in aggregate, students gained an additional 40 days, the equivalent of an additional 40 days of math instruction and 28 days of reading instruction. So their standardized test scores were as if they had attended school for an extra 40 days or an extra 28 days compared to students in traditional public schools. Now, if you see this breakdown of cities around the country, again, you'll see that in 11 cities, the charter sectors produced smaller learning gains in reading and math than their district peers, and in 24 cities, they created larger gains. So now, I understand that in some cities here. They might not be in Mesa, Arizona, or Phoenix, or El Paso. They may not be super excited about their charter schools. But there's lots of examples here, from New York City to Boston, Memphis, Cleveland, Dallas, where there's a strong correlation between charter schools and learning gains. Interestingly, even though it's not on this graph, the Credo did study, they didn't look at charter schools in Kansas City, which would have been really helpful for me this morning. But they did look at charter schools in St. Louis, which I would say is perhaps the closest approximation that we have of what's happening in Kansas City. And this is what they found. So the first thing, if we just look at the characteristics of the students that charter schools serve, oftentimes you hear that the population of students that attend charter schools is vastly different than traditional public schools. Perhaps they're poorer, or they have higher rates of special needs, and that's why traditional public schools might perform more poorly. And you can see that generally speaking in St. Louis, the TPS is traditional public schools. They have a slightly higher percentage of students with special needs. They have a higher percentage of students who are English language learners, but on the poverty level, they're about the same. And if you look at the math and reading test scores, this is the percentage of schools in St. Louis that perform worse than traditional public schools, no different than traditional public schools, or better than traditional public schools. So to be honest, in math, it's very much a mixed bag in St. Louis. About 42% of the schools perform worse than traditional public schools, 32% of schools perform better, or perform about the same, 26% perform better. In reading, it's a little bit clearer. Only 17% of schools in St. Louis performed worse, 50% were about the same, and a full third were better than their traditional counterparts. But now this is simply talking about students who actually attend charter schools. Did the students who attend charter schools do better? We also care about what happens to the students who are left behind in traditional public schools. You often hear the best and brightest students leave, and I can tell you, based on the available evidence, the most comprehensive study of this by the RAND Corporation looked in 8 different states. There's no evidence in any of the locations that charter schools are negatively affecting the achievement of students in nearby traditional public schools. Now, interestingly, it also says there's little evidence of a positive competitive impact. But generally speaking, the argument is that charter schools don't harm the traditional public schools around them. They don't necessarily help the traditional public schools around them, but it's essentially a wash. Now, I also talked about private school choice programs. So this is charter schools, which are public schools, independent, autonomous public schools. But people also think about things like school vouchers, tuition tax credits, which we'll be talking about later. This is something else that has been studied, the effect of, now I believe there are 16 school voucher programs around the country. There are things like 11 tuition tax credit programs around the country. And they have been studied extensively. And so on the next slide, I'm just going to warn you, I've decided to put every study that I could find that has asked the question, in cities or states where there have been vouchers, what was the effect on the public schools that are left behind? And because I put a bunch of studies up here, I decided to do a little color coding. So I'll tell you, the studies that are highlighted in green are studies that showed that traditional public schools did better when students left. So the program was a net positive for the children that were left behind. Yellow says that the students were no better or no worse for having the school choice program there. And red is that the students did worse for having it. So green is good, right? If we want the children left behind in public schools to do well. Yellow is the same, red is negative. So this is what they show. So if you look at, these are a variety of different researchers. You see a variety of different cities. And a pretty consistent finding that students remain in public schools in places that have voucher programs end up doing better on standardized tests on measures of math and reading. And I should say that even the researchers that completed all of this, so for those of you who are fans of prominent economists, C.C. Rouse, who was on President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, Carolyn Hoxby, I believe, who was also, at least for a time, was a major advisor of President Obama, Paul Peterson, who's a prominent professor at Harvard, Marty West, who is as well, Rajahari, I'm going to butcher her first name, Chakrabarty, who's with the New York Fed. So a whole bunch of people, David Figlio, folks that are from all across the country, from all sorts of ideological backgrounds, some of which think that vouchers are a good idea, some of which think that vouchers are a bad idea, but again, have consistently found students left behind. And we can talk about later, if you're curious about this, they've surmised a variety of reasons why they think that is the case. Now, whenever we talk about private school choice in the state of Missouri, another myth that often comes up is to say, hey, it may be great for these places. Oh, Milwaukee, it looks like it went well. Ohio, it looks like it went well. San Antonio, it's great. Well, but we can't actually do that in Missouri because in the Missouri Constitution, there's something that's known as a Blaine Amendment. So in the Constitution of this state, this language is in it. And it says, neither the General Assembly nor any county, city, town, township, school district, or other municipal corporation shall ever make an appropriation to pay any public fund to support any private or public school, academy, seminary, college, university, or other institution controlled by any religious creed, church, or sectarian denomination. And that's because if things with school vouchers or others allow the dollars to go to non-religious schools, but also to go to religious schools. So a consistent thing that you hear is, hey, look, these actually exist in 37 different state constitutions. Hey, you can't do it in these states. I do want to take just 1 second to talk a bit about Blaine amendments because I think there are some myths around it. And the first of which is sort of myths around the origins. And this is where Blaine amendments come from. So this is a cartoonist, the famous Thomas Nast, who was the prominent critic of Tammany Hall and others. This is a sad chapter in American history where a strain of virulent anti-Catholicism gripped the sort of, I don't know if you want to call them intelligentsia, but the leadership of America. So if you notice here, the alligators that are coming out are Catholic bishops. Here is St. Peter's, the political Roman Catholic Church. And you see here, U.S. public schools. That's where the evil papists are going towards. And the schoolhouse leader is protecting our children from that, while another one is being led to the guillotine. And again, this is famous cartoonist Thomas Nast. This is the time in America in which Blaine amendments were started. James G. Blaine was a senator from Maine who wanted to amend the U.S. Constitution to include basically this language. And the reason he was because he was a virulent anti-Catholic. And as in the Northeast, in Maine and Massachusetts and Philadelphia and all of these cities, more Irish, Italian, and other immigrants came in, you have to remember at this time period, what we considered public schools were really Protestant in their denomination. They read the King James Bible. They started the day by singing hymns. And as more Catholics came in, Catholics asked for accommodation. And they said, hey, during Bible reading time in the morning, is it possible for our students to read the Catholic Bible? So notice they didn't say we want to take the Bible out of there. They just said, is it possible for us to read our Bible? Can our children read our hymns? That led to, in 1844, what are known as the Philadelphia Bible riots, where depending on whose question you ask, either a group of Catholics burned down some Protestant churches and the Protestants then burned down some Catholic churches, or vice versa. That all came around these sorts of accommodations. So in response to this treatment, Catholics all across the country created their own parallel system of schools. And in many places, it just wasn't a big deal. The state felt totally fine supporting those schools. It allowed parents who chose to send their kids to various schools to go there with state funding, and it wasn't a big deal. Interestingly, in lots of countries around the world, England, Ireland, the Netherlands, Chile, everywhere, it's kind of not a big deal. Kids go to where their parents want them to go. Their state funding follows them, private, public, religious, whatever you want to do, it's not a big deal. But in America, it became one. And so he tried to amend the U.S. Constitution to stifle, to stop all of those schools. Interestingly, one last bit of history, this came to a head, these Blaine amendments were passed, but in the most stringent version in 1922 in the state of Oregon, famous Supreme Court case called Pierce versus the Society of Sisters. Oregon actually tried to make private religious schooling illegal. So not just not supported by public dollars, but illegal. And the U.S. Supreme Court eventually ruled on the side of the Society of Sisters, a group of nuns who are operating schools there. And the famous line from that is that a child is not a mere instrument of the state. It's a belief that parents have some right to direct their child the way that they best see fit. What is often left out is who was the group that was supporting the plaintiff in trying to make private and religious schools illegal. That would be the Imperial Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. So know that when people talk about things like Blaine amendments, when they talk about those, that is the intellectual history that they come from, and I think is something to bring up. But Blaine amendments across the country are being challenged. This is a picture of beautiful Douglas County, Colorado. For those of you that are interested in education reform, I think Douglas County is one of the most interesting school districts in America right now. I was just had dinner with the superintendent on Monday night, Liz Fagan, who is a spark plug. She is outstanding. And she has created, I think, at one time, both what many people would consider one of the most progressive school districts, but also one filled with reforms that we might consider more from the political right. So they don't really like standardized testing. They don't like evaluating teachers based on testing. They've developed these kind of rubrics for it. They use this whole child kind of constructivist education. They're not really big fans of the Common Core either. But at the same time, they wanted to offer in their school district of 67,000 kids complete school choice. So if you want to go to their public schools, if you want to go to the charter schools, and even for about 500 kids, if they wanted to go to private schools, she was totally fine with that. They wanted to arrange transportation. It's a really, really cool school district that I recommend you checking out. But the case was challenged all the way in court. It has since been stopped. The 500 students had to go back to the traditional public schools. Just in the last month, it made its way all the way to the Colorado Supreme Court that ruled it illegal on Blaine Amendment grounds. However, it's looking like, depending on one or two signatures at the U.S. Supreme Court that they're waiting on, the constitutionality of Blaine amendments will most likely be challenged in the next Supreme Court term, or they're at least trying to get it on the docket there. I was talking with one of the lead lawyers on it, and he said, I think we have a good chance of getting it on the court, but a bad chance is sort of 1 in 1,000, and now we think it's about 1 in 100. So we'll see if it makes it there. So on one level, Blaine amendments are being challenged all around the country, which would strike down Missouri's Blaine amendment that they have. But then in another way, a type of program that we're going to talk about in the future, in the next couple slides, tuition tax credits were designed as a way to help provide private school choice without violating Blaine amendments. Because what it essentially does, and again, I'll walk through it in a second, is establish a private scholarship granting organization that people can give their money to that gives out scholarships, and then they get a credit on their tax bill against it. And the U.S. Supreme Court in Arizona Christian School Tuition Organization versus Winn argued that these things are constitutional. So when I talk about this in a moment, and they did have the great line, is that if you were to think that they're unconstitutional, that means you would have to assume that all income is government property, even if it has not come into the tax collector's hands, which is a clever line there. I see taxation is stealing back there. Give me the thumbs up. Love it, sir. Okay. Great. So one thing that I also want to add, I know we're in Kansas City right now, and that's part of it, but I think a prominent myth that exists in the state, it happens when I go down to Jeff City or when I talk to people, people tell me, oh, yeah, I know, you're a Kansas City boy. The way Kansas City's got problems, or, we go to St. Louis has problems. I get it. But, the rest of the state, we're doing all right. We're doing pretty well. Right? The laughter, I think, knows that y'all know that this is a myth too. But, so what I did, and I'm thankful for the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, I reached out, my research assistant Brittany reached out to them to get course enrollment information. So I was interested in lots of these districts exist. There are 520 school districts in Missouri. How many students are enrolled in what we call sort of higher level coursework, calculus, physics, AP classes, etc. And I was able to create this chart. So these are the percentage of districts in Missouri that have zero goose egg students enrolled in chemistry, enrolled in physics. This is enrolled in Algebra 1, but I think it's Algebra 1 in 8th grade, calculus, and AP classes, broken down by urban and rural. So there are some problems in Missouri, 12 or 15 districts that don't have students that are enrolled in AP classes. But the real problem that you see here are actually in our rural districts. And remember, there's about 450 rural districts. So this number here, total number of districts in Missouri where not a single student takes an AP class is north of 270. 270 districts in Missouri, not a single student takes an AP class. This is, I think, is around 250, about 250 districts in Missouri, not a single student takes calculus. Here, down closer to, I think, 200, not a single student takes physics, right? Not even having the opportunity to take these types of courses. And we're going to talk a little bit in a second about what we can do about it. Because this, I think, is the most enduring myth and one that we need to dispel. And it is a belief that we can't do anything, that we've tried everything under the sun, it's just not going to work. You might talk to a state legislator and they say, hey, look, we got bigger fish to fry. We've been trying to solve this problem. So I want to walk through what I think are four policies that could exist in Missouri that I think would actually make a difference on a lot of these indicators that we've been talking about. And the first policy is a program that's called an education savings account. Now, has anyone here in the room heard about education savings accounts before? Okay, great. Okay, cool. So we're working with some baseline knowledge here. But basically, the way that works is if you think state, district, federal dollars are all allotted on a per pupil basis. And right now, even in things like charter schools or school voucher programs, that money is taken as one kind of giant coupon, if you will, that is then given to a school who is then in charge of a child's education for their entire school day, school year, etc. What ESAs, which now exist in about 5 states, Florida, Mississippi, Tennessee, and the largest exists in Nevada, what they say is, what if we took that money and rather than treating it as one giant allotment, put it in a flexible use spending account, like an HSA, that students are then free to spend on approved coursework. So if, for example, you want to take that tuition, take that money to pay your tuition at private school, totally cool. You can take that money and you can do it. If, however, you'd like to divide it, let's say between purchase a Rosetta Stone class to teach yourself a foreign language, to hire a private tutor to teach yourself things, to use massive open online courses that are available in lots of subjects and that are extremely inexpensive. And one of the great things about education savings accounts is any money that you don't spend in the given school year, you can roll into a 529 college savings account. So savvy parents in Nevada and Arizona and other places, by the decisions that they choose to make, are actually helping their children pay for college as well. And if done right, it can pay for up to, I think some people have been able to get as many as 2 years of college out of great use of this. So I think that that's a way that we can encourage types of these schools of the future that don't necessarily say, that don't function the way that they traditionally function, that are able to divide amongst a bunch of these cool providers that are out there and make new things that are available. So that's number one policy that I think could be positive. The second one is the one that I talked about when we were talking about Blaine amendments, and these are tuition tax credit scholarships. So in this case, the state would create the ability for these organizations to exist. Again, these exist in about 16 states right now. If my math is, if I remember correctly, things are always changing. And what these scholarship granting organizations do is give scholarships to generally low-income students to attend private schools, right? And rather than talk about state allocations or whatever, what happens, individuals and corporations can donate to these scholarships. And the money that they donate to these scholarships when tax day comes around can be credited against their tax bill. So notice it's not a deduction, but a credit. So in some states where it's 100% credit, if you give $10,000, there's usually income limits on these things, but if you give $10,000 to this, you pay $10,000 less in taxes. In other places, it's a 75% credit or a 50% credit. And then those scholarships are able to be used for lots of students. In places like Florida, it's like 30,000 students that use this. In Pennsylvania, 50,000 students that create scholarships for. So that's another policy that would expand the universe of options that are available to students in Missouri, and again avoid thorny constitutional issues and kind of much sort of avoid government involved with at all. Now the third one is, I think, one of the most interesting programs that's now exists in 11 states across the country. They're called course access programs. And I think this specifically for a lot of these rural schools that are struggling to provide that higher level coursework for people. What this does, it says, let's say the state gives, the state per pupil allotment is $6,000. What it allows students to do is to divide that up. It's generally for high school students, but divide it up into 8 $750 portions, and then says, hey, you can take 2 or 3 of these. You usually can't do it with your whole allotment, but 2 or 3 of these to go to an outside provider for courses if your school doesn't offer it, if you're not happy with what your school offers you. So if you don't have calculus, while the rest of the students in class are going to math, algebra 2 or trigonometry or whatever, you might be able to go to the local community college to take a calculus course. You might be able to go online or work with a private tutor or any of those things to get that coursework that you don't like. If you want to take Mandarin or Farsi or Arabic instead of the Spanish Spanish or French that are offered at most schools. You could do that really cool, and it's actually inexpensive, low-cost tutoring that exists there. Or lots of places down in Louisiana and elsewhere, a lot of the trade organizations are working, creating coursework that is aligned to this, to teach welding and other practical things. This allows students to get a jump start on college, provides flexibility, and generally speaking, in most cases, these online courses cost a lot less than this $750 that you can divide, and the school's able to keep it. In another thing that's very cool, lots of schools and districts are developing their own courses and putting them out in this market. There are some teachers that are making a lot of money doing this because their math class or there are things working, and they can enroll a bunch of students in it. There are lots of tiny school districts that are developing really cool calculus, physics, foreign language programs, and they're using these as drivers. And then the last one that I would talk about is the idea of expanding charter schools outside of Kansas City and St. Louis. Right now, they're only allowed in the St. Louis district and the Kansas City district. To be honest, so 41 states across the country allow charter schools. We're one of the only states in the nation that geographically limits them. And almost everywhere else, students, and unfortunately what that leads to in lots of these cases, it's more pronounced in the St. Louis metro area than is here. You know, you have some charter schools that exist right here. You know, the Normandy schools, the Riverview Garden schools that lost accreditation this year, Northside School, they would love to serve these kids, but the boundaries that have been put up there don't allow them to do that. There are lots of schools that would like to locate in these areas. So allowing schools, allowing students, charter schools to open in these areas and allowing open enrollment between these districts. So if a school's in Normandy, even if you're from Rittenhour, or if you're from Jennings, allowing you to go to those schools, I think would break down a lot of the barriers that exist in these little school districts that have popped up. So we could have, let's say you have a school that's in Independence, but students from anywhere in the Kansas City metro area or anywhere in the state, if they want to, would be able to travel to them. So really though, what I want to close with, and I'll let the joke sink in here for a second, is that oftentimes, you know, we can feel kind of hopeless, right? That we can feel hopeless, that there's nothing that we can do. I will tell you, and what I hope to do, over the course of the next many, many years that I work here and that we all interact with one another, I hope to actually be a place of hope here. And to talk about, and I think you're going to see across a variety of policy issues, not just in education, but the stuff Patrick Toohey does here on Kansas City issues, stuff Pat Ishmael, who's there in the back, talking about healthcare and others. It's very easy for us to talk about what we think is going wrong. But what we're going to talk about here are solutions. Right? Trying to talk about advancing policies that can actually help solve some of these problems, working with the community, working with the civil society all across the state to make these. So hopefully Kevin Bacon won't die, because I think that's just something that is too terrible to bear. But I'll close with that and say I would love to take your questions. Oh, thank you.